Colleagues, good morning, good afternoon and good evening. A very big welcome to all of you and deep appreciation to you all for finding the time in your busy schedules and joining today's meeting. Bienvenue et merci beaucoup d'avoir rejoint and bienvenido y muchas gracias por unirte. Bienvenido y muito obrigado por participar. Today's meeting will be available in all three of the languages that I just spoke, and you will be able to access the simultaneous translation by choosing your language using the interpretation button on Zoom. I'd invite you all to find that button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screens, above a little world map and the word interpretation. Even if you are listening to today's meeting in English, please do choose it because that will ensure that you receive English translation for when someone speaks in either French, Spanish, or Portuguese. And obviously, if you'd prefer to listen to the meeting in any of those languages, once again, choose that. I'd also like you to become familiar with another one of the Zoom buttons, and that is the mute function. I think most of you are already on mute, and I appreciate you for doing so. Please stay on mute to avoid any unnecessary background noise, which will mean that we can all hear the speakers, until, of course, you're invited to make an intervention, at which point you'll be able to come off. The one final thing I would like to say before we get started is you might like to use the chat function to introduce yourselves to give everyone on the call a sense of who's here today. We just invite you to share your name and the parliament from which you come to give all of the participants a sense of the breadth of participation from right across the world into today's meeting. We've got a lot to get through today, and in addition to the remarks from some of our outstanding speakers, we really want to spend a lot of today's meeting hearing from you, being inspired by what you're doing in your parliaments to improve and of course increase financing for education, and also give you the opportunity to ask questions of some of the participants. So with that in mind, and without any further delay, I'm going to hand over now to the opening chair for today's meeting, Harriet Baldwin. Harriet is a member of the UK Parliament and, of course, the global co-chair of the International Parliamentary Network for Education. Harriet, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you on the call, and I want to thank you, Joseph, and your team at IPNED for putting in such hard work, not only to organise this afternoon's event, but also working with us as co-chairs to establish the International Parliamentary Network for Education. It is a new network which brings together those of us who care passionately about Sustainable Development Goal for a quality education for every child and its foundation for making the world a better place. And I'm delighted that we are now up to over 300 parliamentarians from over 50 countries around the world who are championing this cause. And IPNED is there as a resource to help you with your work. And www.ipned.org is a great website where you can find all sorts of really helpful statistics and, of course, lots of resources and leaflets for your work. I'm also I'm sure everyone is aware that this is an absolutely pivotal time for education, that the pandemic has affected every child in every country, but of course it's affected the poorest children in the poorest countries the most. And it's had a real impact on not only the quality but the quantity of every child's education, with so many children now permanently out of school as a result of this pandemic. And so we're at a pivotal time as a world. And this meeting is really to presage a meeting 2 months hence, where the UK government and the Kenyan government, I'm delighted to say, have agreed to host the replenishment of the Global Partnership for Education, an opportunity for the world to show how much investing in children's education means to them and how much it will underpin our recovery and our bounce back in this pandemic. So I want to start today's impressive lineup of speakers with one of the very most impressive campaigners for education in our world today, the Honourable Julia Gillard. She was obviously a member of the Australian Parliament, member of Minister for Education, and of course people will remember her as Australia's 27th Prime Minister. And she delivered so many reforms for Australian children across the age groups, and now of course continues her passion and her work as chair of the board of directors of the Global Partnership for Education. And since 2014, she's been playing a central role in the partnership's development and growth and in global education progress more broadly. I can't think of a better person to introduce to start today's important meeting than the Honourable Julia Gillard. The floor is yours.
Harriet, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Joseph, thank you to you and to everything that the team at IPNED does. It's a fantastic network and it's just so impressive to see the faces gathered on the screen. I remember a few things from my time as a parliamentarian. One thing I remember is that time was always short. So I am very grateful that you've made the time to join into this meeting today. And I don't take that for granted. I know how difficult it is. Another thing I very clearly remember is when parliamentarians rally in large numbers, then they have an impact. They make a difference. And that's what I'm going to be urging you to do in the weeks that remain between now and the 28th and 29th of July, when the education world will gather in London under the co-hosting of Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Kenyatta of Kenya, to urge the world to raise their hand for education. That's what we're asking people to do. As Harriet has said, we come into this moment with a sense of responsibility, indeed a sense of crisis. Before any of us were using the terminology coronavirus or COVID-19, before we'd heard those words, we were already in the midst of an education emergency. We knew that there were around 250 million children who were out of school and hundreds of millions more who were in school for such a short period of time or in schools of such poor quality that even the basics of literacy and numeracy escaped them. And of course, who was missing out? Fitted to patterns of underlying disadvantage. And so the children most likely to be missing out on school were the poorest, the most marginalised, the girls, the children with disabilities, children whose lives were already very under pressure, who were then missing out on the education that could turn their lives around. In the days of the pandemic, the Global Partnership for Education has mobilised to try and support countries, more than 60 of them, to maintain educational continuity and to ensure that when schools reopen, every child returns. But we are fearful about the educational deficits that have been built up during this period. And because we know that earlier health emergencies like the Ebola epidemic meant that when schools closed, some of the most marginalised children didn't come back, we fear that risk here too. Which means it's exactly the right time to be rallying to raise new resources to support the education of every child. The Global Partnership for Education Summit at the end of July will have a few important aspects. We are calling on the donor community, which is predominantly nation-state donors through their overseas development aid budgets and philanthropy, to contribute at least $5 billion to support the work of GPE for the next 5 years. We can show through our demonstrated track record of making change that replenished in that way, that we can get 88 million more children into school and we can improve the quality of and access to qualified teachers of hundreds of millions more children. And I'm happy to go into more details of that if time permits. We need those resources given the scale of the challenge. The second major thing that will happen at the end of July is that developing countries, GPE has an eligibility of up to 90 countries around the world, low income and lower middle income countries. Developing countries will come to the event and make pledges themselves about growing their education budgets over time. And those pledges are always valuable, but they are even more valuable at this moment when economies are under pressure and the temptation to roll back expenditure on services like education is right there in front of leaders of nations. So those pledges are incredibly important. And it will also be, and I think this is the third dimension, the first time the global education community has rallied as a whole during the days of the pandemic to remind the world how important education is. Yes, all of us want to see the pandemic, the health crisis solved. We want to see the world vaccinated. We want to see people able to go back out into public spaces, to see their families and friends, their loved ones, to hug them. We want to see economies return to growth. But if we are going to secure the long-term benefits of peace and prosperity for the global community, then that has to come with education being a principal investment at this time. This is not an either or, it must be a both. We are pleased with the response that we are receiving so far from donors to GPE, but this is not an easy world in which to mobilise large level resources, which is why in the weeks that remain, these absolutely critical weeks, we need your support, we need your engagement, your public advocacy, you going to executive government, to the leaders of your nation and putting to them the case for education and for making ambitious pledges at the summit at the end of July. Harriet, with those words, thank you once again for the opportunity. Thank you to Joseph, and I return the program back to you. Thank you.
Menaz.
Menaz is actually joining us. Menaz, I don't know if you were able to thank the Honourable Julia Gillard.
Thank you, Menaz.
Thank you, Julia. It is a huge privilege to have you with us today and to hear from you about the Global Partnership of Education's work, which is so important to so many of us developing countries. The importance of securing a fully funded partnership and its aim of supporting countries to secure more funding for education and spend it more effectively, especially in the crisis that we are still facing. Some of our countries in this region are still in the grip of COVID-19. My name is Mehnaz Akbar Aziz, and I'm a member of the National Assembly of Pakistan and the Asia representative of IPNED's Global Executive. Pakistan has been a GPE partner country since 2012, and we have benefited greatly from GPE's funding and expertise. And recently, GPE has also given us funding for post-COVID-19 and during COVID-19 for our schooling systems, which we didn't have in our country. However, there remains a huge amount to do in Pakistan, in which nearly 23 million children are still not in school, and where education financing needs to grow significantly. And here I'm going to echo Julia's concern about children not coming back to school, dropping out and not coming back to school post-COVID. And we do need to strengthen our partnership with GPE and grow this partnership. And there are many countries like ours who would need that. One of the things I value about being a member of IPNED is hearing about the experiences of other countries. And it's such a great platform to energize and come together, all of the parliamentarians coming together to raise our voices. It really gives me immense pleasure. And I tell you, I'm going to share it here, that the Speaker of our National Assembly is very supportive of this initiative. It is as though it's our initiative. It's just simply great. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our next speaker, His Excellency Dr. David Moinina Senge, Minister of Education of Sierra Leone. I'm also delighted that with us from Sierra Leone are representatives from the Education for All Coalition, very important, and their Girl Leaders program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And Sierra Leone remains committed as board members of GPE and to really continue to promote for education financing. And just a couple months ago, with the Minister of Finance, we wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times, and we'll continue doing this as well leading up to the summit. We're really excited to be able to join the summit in person. The President of Sierra Leone will be there, and I'll be there as well, speaking, and we'll be joining Honorable Julia Gillard and the rest of the team in UK to continue advocating for increased financing. No, the other major program I had today was the Joint Education Sector Review, and the people who spoke was one of the people who spoke at the session was one of our parliamentarians, the parliamentarian committee that does oversight on basic education, and we have a scheduled engagement between my ministry and the parliament as well, not just the oversight committee, but a major cross-section of all the parties as well focused on education, because we think education, particularly as it comes to policies, it's everybody's business, and so we're excited that we are able to share ideas and learn from and with parliamentarians, not just from Sierra Leone, but from all over the world. When we think about the impact of COVID on delivery and financing education in Sierra Leone, it's twofold. In the first instance, we know the numbers of school people who are affected by school closures in Sierra Leone. We have about 2.6 million kids who are in school from pre-primary all the way through secondary school. And it was a major issue for us because just 2 years prior, the government had started this free quality school education program, and we added 700,000 new students within one term to the classroom. So when schools were going to be closed, and we knew that during Ebola, when schools closed, there were lots of kids who did not return back to school. And this was a major issue for us. So right before then, with our index case, we launched a radio teaching program because we knew that this was effective then during Ebola. And we were able to, in communities where people did not have radio signal, we partnered with community radio stations and paid for their time, paid for their programming for them to continue their education radio programming. We provided radio to communities, particularly to girls. We saw that before, if the radio is a very prized asset at home, and the person who gets to listen to the radio is the father. And so a child or a girl child is not going to say, Dad, I want the radio to go and listen to education radio when the father wants to listen to the news or anything else. And so we provided solar radio in many of the communities that we were in. And because it was both then not just the programming on the radio, on air, but it was making sure that they had access, that they can tune into frequencies and catch the radio program. And finally, that they have the devices available for them. And because the president takes education very importantly, I was on the presidential task force for COVID. And so when there was an opportunity for us to return some fraction of our students to transition, because we knew that we had about 400,000 kids who had essentially spent 2 terms of their year. So if they had lost those 2 terms, it would be a major, major blow on our system, and we wouldn't be able to absorb them during the next year. We're able to convince the presidential task force to allow us to bring back those 400,000 kids over a 5 to 8 week period to take their exams. And in that period, we provided school feeding, brought food for them. We're able to, when the curfews were lifted, the inter-district lockdown, we provided buses to carry them. We provided training to all the teachers, provided face masks, a thermometer, buckets, wash facilities, and essentially also provided printed physical material to those schools, particularly in hard to reach areas, for them to prepare. and they were able to take their exams, and many of them did very, very well. And it was a big, and during that period, we had no transmission of COVID. We had intensive COVID precaution and COVID messaging as well. But what was really interesting is that we increased our budget on education from 21% to 22%. And again, it's one of those where we are spending a lot more on education. And even within the economic challenges that we had in the country, particularly due to COVID and with decreased national revenue mobilization, we still were able to establish partnerships within the World Bank. So the World Bank Accelerators Country Program, we are leveraging relationships with FCDO and the Gates Foundation and the RISE program, so that we're focused on quality teaching and what quality really means. We're using partnerships with universities in Sierra Leone and Harvard, MIT, and in the UK to be able to help us to do analysis and develop new programs that focus on hybrid systems and civics, for example. And we're developing new curriculum, and we're expanding on how we can do teaching and learning in different ways. And this costs money. And so we've been able to mobilize and engage with the Ministry of Finance in particular, such that we can recruit more teachers. So last year we recruited about 5,000 new teachers. We increased their salary by about 30%. And this year I was just with the president over the week on Monday in another district, and we were there to open a hospital. And I was with the chief minister, and he called me whilst at the high table to say, what's up with the 1,000 recruitment that we said we were going to do? So even as there's a lot more money and pool on resources, he's still pushing for us to recruit more teachers and go from there. And I think this is really in part because of the kinds of partnerships that we have. GPE remains a critical partnership. I mentioned that I was coming from the Joint Sector Review today that is happening. It's GPE funded grants, separate from the existing SPIC that we have. Sierra Leone has been a member now of the board for the last 3 years, first as an alternate board member, and now as a board member. And we're contributing firsthand and seeing the transformation that's happening within GPE. We've been able to really focus on, so our current grant is a $17 million program, and it focuses on pre-primary and preschools. And this month, we're opening about 60 new preschool classrooms. And we'll continue to do this. We have about 100 preschool classrooms that we're opening, and we'll develop new curriculum. I'm bringing the ECD policy to cabinet next week. We had one. We're expanding it and really making it the central part to how we do education service delivery. So I do want to call on all the members here to really encourage their governments to invest more in education, because it's an investment. It may seem like you're asking for more, but it's okay. It's an investment for other areas. And I really want to call on the members here as well to ensure that they commit their governments to increasing domestic financing for education as well, even in periods like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. So impressive, and so proud of your leadership, under which Sierra Leone is leading the world on the issue of education financing, increasing the sector's share of the national budget to 22%. You're a model for the global reality. From your kind self, we have heard loud and clear today that historically education budgets have been under-resourced, and how spending has failed to benefit the poorest and most marginalized learners. And we are very impressed with the initiatives that Sierra Leone has taken. I know firsthand myself that active engagement by parliamentarians in the budgeting process can help change that. I'm delighted that we can now hear from Action Aid International's board chair, Niradzi Gambonzwanda, on the importance of parliamentarians working with civil society to increase funding for education and improve how the funding is spent.
My name is Nyaradzai Gumbondrandra. I am the chair of Action Aid International and founder of Rosaria Memorial Trust here in Zimbabwe. I serve as the African Union Goodwill Ambassador on ending child marriage. Today, I join the world in calling for greater financing to education. In the era of COVID-19, we have seen less resources going into education, and at the same time, we've seen the impact of COVID-19 on learning outcomes, especially for children living in rural areas and mostly for girls. We've seen an increase in teenage pregnancy and in child marriage, and these children deserve to go back to school. I echo the statement by President Uhuru Kenyatta as we walk towards the Global Summit on Education. I'm asking our governments and donors to increase financing to GPE and to other resources for education, but ultimately, it is about domestic financing of education. It is about our governments generating the necessary revenue in order to ensure that education is resourced. Progressive tax is one way in which this can be achieved. Wealth tax is one way in which this can be achieved. And at the same time, we are asking the global financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, to ensure that education is protected and that austerity measures when our countries borrow do not impact on education. Ultimately, education is a right. Our member states have obligations and responsibilities. Communities are doing their best. Let's continue to invest in education for us to have a better future. I thank you.
We are very grateful to Neeraj for sharing those remarks. Colleagues, we are here today because we are committed to ensuring that every child and young person can access their right to a quality education. And most important, post-COVID. Listening to and engaging with young people is critical, absolutely critical, to ensuring that we understand their needs and concerns and respond accordingly to support them. I'm delighted that we are joined by Shraddha Koirala of GPE Youth Leader, who is also the youth focal person at the National Campaign for Education, Nepal. Shraddha has worked tirelessly to raise awareness of the barriers to education, and we look forward to now hearing from her.
Thank you for this opportunity. I would first like to share the education situation in my region. Actually, I just now came to know that a young girl of 12 years old who was dreaming to be a nurse was pushed for child marriage few months ago because her family suffered from financial crisis soon after the second wave of lockdown. They thought that marriage was an easy option for her rather than her education. Not only this, in my neighborhood, a younger brother takes his online class in mobile, which the elder sister never have access to, nor even the online classes. Not only this, it was also found that some of the children who were visually impaired or who were deaf were not allowed to join in the Zoom classes by their teachers because the teacher themselves feel difficult to teach to these children. Even the radio and television programs were not accessible to all. So these students are facing multiple levels of discrimination. So will they be able to go back to school again? There are many such stories to share in this forum. So because of the short time, I think it might not be appropriate. So after all, how many children and youth should ruin their bright future just because government is not able to cope up with the learning challenges during this COVID situation? The case of digital divide, learning inequalities, and frustration in children and teachers are in every corner of my society. And it's not only a single child or their family who is going to be affected by it. We say that education transforms our lives, education transforms our communities. But is it that one COVID wave is transforming the whole education system in such a way that the education transformation that we obtained in last one decade is likely to revert back? Are the million of children who are dropping out from education in last 1 year likely to return back to school once again? Are we committed upon it? So we need to think and we need to discuss upon that. Today, we young people, we want the commitment from world leaders to ensure that there are sufficient resources for providing quality education to all the children across the globe. They should ensure that there are no child who becomes isolated from education system just because the education system itself is not compatible for them. In the name of COVID or any other emergency pandemic situation, there should not be the learning loss of any children across the globe. And this is the reason where financing today for education really matters for me. So I feel the government should protect and increase the domestic financing to education and also ensure the efficient and equitable spending, because it's not just about the money, it's also about the efficient and equitable use of resources. We have seen that despite of the budget allocation, there is the problem of budget freezing or its misutilization also in my nation. Funds allocated for scholarship are being used for the buildings. Funds allocated for uniform or textbook, they are being used for the salary because there are no sufficient resources to really provide quality, equitable, and inclusive education. The financing gap is twice more than the fund actually that is required to provide quality education to these children. So as a young person today, through this platform, I ask parliamentarians and donor communities to ensure that your government makes an ambitious pledge to GP at this Global Education Summit. Thank you. I'd like to stop here.
Well, thank you so much, Shraddha. It was wonderful to hear you speaking up on behalf not only of young people in Nepal, but young people all around the world. And in the UK, we recently had a delegation from Send My Friend to School with young people from across schools in the United Kingdom, all adding their voice to the campaign for quality education for every child in the world. And it's so wonderful to hear you speaking so powerfully on the subject. I know that for many members of Parliament, it's really one of the most powerful ways that they can hear about the importance from this is from young people themselves. But I also want to bring in someone with a very powerful voice who continues to dedicate his work to this important cause. I'm thrilled now to bring in another former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Gordon Brown, who is our final speaker today. Gordon Brown and I are from completely different ends of the political spectrum in the UK, but show the cross-party support that there is here for our shared commitment to ensuring that every child benefits from a quality education. It's a shared commitment which reunites all of us from all of the different countries and all of the different parties on the call today. Gordon Brown is currently the UN Special Envoy for Global Education. He also chairs the Education Cannot Wait high-level steering group. And Education Cannot Wait does so much as the global fund for education in emergencies to make sure that education reaches children even in the most difficult conditions. So we're very grateful for this contribution from Gordon Brown. Thank you.
I want to thank the International Parliamentary Network for Education for assembling such a great panel of speakers for this important event and for all the work you do in promoting education. And in particular, I want to congratulate you on highlighting just what we have to do to meet the Sustainable Development Goals for universal schooling and education. Education, as we all know, is the key that unlocks every development goal. And sometimes one image can sum up a feeling far more powerfully than any words written or speech uttered. Etched in my mind is a photograph of a 3-year-old boy that many will remember. The red t-shirted boy, Alan Kurdi, lying face down, dead on a Mediterranean beach, his legs and hands outstretched. And it was a picture that traveled the world a few years ago. But Alan's full story and its significance has rarely been told. Alan had left Turkey for one reason. His parents wanted him to have the education that had ceased to be available after Syria exploded into civil war. Again and again, I've seen how families desperate for the chance of an education for their children have lost out because of conflicts and civil wars. In Rwanda's Kigali Genocide Memorial, the museum commemorating the genocide of 1994, is a photograph of another boy called David. What he wanted more than anything else was an education so that he could be a doctor. Under the photograph of him in the museum is a plaque that reads, David, age 11, ambition to be a doctor, favorite sport, football, favorite hobby, making people laugh, death by mutilation. Last words, the UN are coming to save us. But the UN never did. In his idealism and in his innocence, David believed that we would deliver what we promised, a rescue by the United Nations of the Rwandan genocide affected people, and then an education for him and his friends so he could be a doctor. Now, when this pandemic subsides, we will find that Alan and David were not alone in being denied an education. We will discover that 300 million children are not at school and never go to school, and that the majority of them are girls, many of whom are then forced into early marriage, child labor, or even trafficked. And because we are not only divided between rich and poor, but also divided between the digital rich and the digital poor, we will find that we have to invest in digital inclusion and have not done so. You know, the percentage of children not reading at age 10 is likely to increase by another 10% to 63% because of the pandemic. And this means, according to the Education Commission, that more than 500 million young people will not be able to read properly, and more than 800 million will reach adulthood without basic secondary education level skills. So we need urgently a global education plan. Across the West in the 20th century, a massive expansion in the secondary school population created a new generation of qualified school leavers, and in the end also reduced inequalities in earning power. This century too, a new education expansion must take place globally, combining the human touch of teachers with the potential and reach of AI-powered adaptive learning so that everyone is included. And we must not only transform how we deliver education, but how we finance it to ensure that we reach those furthest behind. And yet, while education aid increased rapidly in the first decade of this century, again in the second half of the second decade, reaching a peak of 16 billion, it has now fallen by 2 billion and may not return after the pandemic to its previous peak before the mid-2020s. It is worth less than $10 per pupil in Africa. UNESCO estimates an external financing gap of 25 billion annually in low and middle income countries, necessary to finance pre-primary and primary education alone. And the G7 and G20 and the international community therefore must agree on education financing to ensure that countries who want to spend on education can do so free of the burden of unpayable debts that is crippling them today, debts that we removed in the early part of the 21st century, but debts that are now mounting because of the scale of the pandemic crisis. And we must also ensure that UNESCO, UNICEF, the Global Partnership for Education, in its replenishment, and Education Cannot Wait, are fully funded. And we will need to mobilize all the resources of the world if we are going to get education on a firm financial footing. That's why I favor an international finance facility for education, under which, through guarantees given by the richest countries as donors, we can multiply resources available to education. Just look at it this way, $2 billion of guarantees, supplemented by 300 million of grants, can allow us to invest over 8 billion in education. And that's as much as is today offered in bilateral aid through all the ODA contributions in the world that we make. We can, if we take the action that's necessary, be the first generation where every single child goes to school. We can be the first generation where, instead of developing only some of the potential of some children in some countries, we develop all of the potential of all children in every country. That must be our aim, and that is our task now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to the Right Honourable Gordon Brown for that very powerful message, taking the top level and the statistics and the organisations and really relating it to a single tragic case that really brings it home to all of us how important this is for every child. And this is the moment where we're going to ask all of you who are participating in the call to actually put your hands up, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands for education before we move on to the discussion. And we're going to try and use that moment where we're all smiling and waving to capture a photograph, because as we heard from the Honourable Julia Gillard at the beginning, it's through hearing their voices in numbers that governments act. And so here today, we have the opportunity to articulate this requirement to fund education around the world to all of our political leaders. So Zoe, I think this is the moment, isn't it, where we all raise our hand like this and we all wave, and I think Zoe's going to try and catch us all smiling. So raise your hands.
Thank you, Harriet.
Okay, I think we're done. Zoe seems very happy. Thank you very much, colleagues, for joining me and raising your hand. I'm going to hand back to Joseph because he's going to facilitate the discussion from all of you. Thank you.
Harriet, thank you for your role today, and more importantly, for your role as the founding co-chair of the International Parliamentary Network for Education. You're a stellar champion for the issue as a member of parliament, as a minister previously, and I know that you're waving the flag for more and better education financing from the UK's ODA budget. I saw references to you today in the paper and the efforts that you're taking on that front, which we applaud. I also just wanted to acknowledge the important contribution that Manaz made today, our Asia representative on the Global Executive. We're deeply grateful for her contribution, both today and more generally. So colleagues, putting your hand up just now is not the only opportunity to participate in this meeting. There is now one to speak, to intervene, to ask questions, and in particular to share what you're doing in your parliament to support education financing. As colleagues said earlier, part of the IPNED platform is inspiring each other, sharing good practice, urging each other on, and maybe even a bit of healthy competition between parliamentarians about who can do the most in service of this important issue. So that's what we wanted to hear a little bit about today. I would say, however, that there are many of you on the call, almost 100, and we already have some people who've indicated that they want to speak. And so on that basis, I'm going to ask you all to be as brief as you possibly can, no more than a minute, so that we get lots of opportunities to hear from you all. So that's a bit of a challenge. And in recognition of the fact that she's joining from Australia, where it is past midnight, I'm going to call on Senator Deborah O'Neill. Deborah is a member of the Global Executive for IPNED. She represents the Oceania region. Deborah, you now have the floor.
I don't know if we're struggling to reach Deborah. She is on the call. Okay,
it's a long way to Australia, so that might be, and the fact that it's midnight might not be helping. I'm going to call on another member of IPNED's Global Executive, the representative from Africa, Professor Julius Ihonvebere. Julius is also the chair of Nigeria's Parliamentary Committee on Basic Education. Nigeria is a case in point where education financing is insufficient, and Julius has been doing a terrific job in really making the case for that. I can see him there. So Julius, if you're in a position to join us, you have the floor. You're on mute, I think. Julius, you'll have to come off mute. There we go.
Thank you so much. I've been listening to the previous speakers, and I think this is a wonderful meeting we're having. I will be very brief. The situation in Nigeria has actually gone from bad to worse. During the COVID pandemic, the federal government announced a 54% reduction in the education budget. 54% reduction. The states were happy to even go below that, to do worse. Now, the situation deteriorated further with the growing insecurity. As we speak, not less than 400 children are under captivity. Boarding houses are being closed. Parents are afraid to send their children to school. Teachers are seeking other forms of appointment. So if we're going to get out of this, the Nigerian government would have to be seriously encouraged to spend money, not just on teachers, but also on school infrastructure to reassure our children. Just one quick example. I just got back from an oversight visit to some of the states to inspect basic education primary schools. They had no perimeter fencing. Those that had, the gates were all floor thrown open, which meant that anybody could walk in, including terrorists and kidnappers. So for us in Nigeria, I think what we're doing in Parliament now is to see in the next budget what we can do to significantly increase the education sector budget, but also for teacher recruitment, for teacher training, for infrastructure, and for ICT. Paying special attention to the girl child because they are the #1 victims of the violence. When the terrorists kidnap them, they threaten to marry them amongst themselves. They will release the boys but marry the girls. So most mothers are afraid to send their kids to school. So I would believe as we get out of the pandemic, there's a need for concerted action. We're willing to learn from other experiences, but we're open to pressuring the government on the need for more finance for the education sector. Also to bring in the private sector, because ultimately when these kids go to school and graduate, the benefits from what they have learned. So in Nigeria right now, they behave as if they're not part of the whole system. So we're working out a strategy in that area. Thank you.
Professor, thank you very much for that and for the reminder, which we read in the newspapers and see on our television screens of the terrible situation of attacks on education and the abduction of school students in Nigeria, which is an all too common occurrence, which coupled with the lack of education financing and the large numbers of out-of-school children really do illustrate the education emergency which the country faces. Good luck in your work in the Parliament to move this issue forward. Colleagues, I wanted to use Professor Yvonne Bere's comments just to remind you all that there are two dimensions to the GP replenishment. To fully funding the partnership over the next 5 years with 5 billion in funding that will come from international donors. The second dimension, which we heard about today, is to support countries like Nigeria and all of the others that are on today's call to increase and improve their own financing of education from their domestic budgets. And that task was set out very well by Naradzai in her remarks. She also mentioned the leadership of the co-host of the Education Summit in the form of President Kenyatta. President Kenyatta has issued a call to action to heads of government and heads of state in GP's partners countries, inviting them to endorse that statement, which calls on those prime ministers and presidents to commit to increasing financing for education and meeting the international benchmarks. So I know that as parliamentarians, you could all play an important role in encouraging your heads of government and heads of state to do exactly that. IPNED's produced a briefing on that for all of you to show you how it's done and also what's in the briefing. But I think it will be, and in the call to action, but I think it will be a very important political statement to get behind if you are from one of the Global Partnership for Education's partner countries, such as Nigeria, which needs obviously to do much more on the question of education financing. So colleagues, with that in mind, I just want to call on a couple of more speakers. I'm delighted that we are joined today by the Honourable Speaker of the Bangladesh Parliament, Dr. Shirin Sharman Chowdhury. Dr. Chowdhury, obviously in his role as Speaker, is playing an important role in the budget process, which began only this week. Dr. Chowdhury, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joseph. Greetings from Bangladesh Parliament. We parliamentarians in Bangladesh are in the process of identifying some critical challenges that we are now facing due to COVID-19 pandemic in our education system. Firstly, the COVID-19 poses the critical challenge for an additional burden of need for huge finance in Bangladesh in imparting online education for our children, particularly in the rural areas. If we want to reach out to the children who cannot physically now come and attend school, but we want to do it through online, the kind of internet infrastructure that is required, the cell phone network, and all the other necessities will be of a huge expense. So that is something that we are trying to work out how we can deal with this additional burden of financing that may be required on this issue. Then the second aspect is we are mindful that no matter what, whenever the schools reopen, the poor children, those who are marginalized and those who are in the disadvantaged rural areas, the girl children, they don't fall out of the loop and they don't fall out of the net. So in any case, we have to try and ensure some kind of inclusive education so that we can reach out to them. Because as we all know, in today's global world, we are pursuing the Sustainable Development Goal agenda that no one should be left behind. And we cannot allow the COVID pandemic to have a negative impact in education in this sector. The other thing is that the ensuring that all students return. This has come up in the discussion by the other distinguished panelists. That is a big challenge. And particularly in case of girl children, whether they have been given away by way of marriage, there has been an increase in child marriage or not, that is something that needs to be looked into. What about the child labor situation? So how we can get them back into the process again is another dire challenge. So however, we are trying to identify and deal with these issues, and we believe that all of this will enhance the education financing burden for us. And even if we need more, but we have to also reprioritize our own budget that we now have, and keeping in view the health sector, we have to also cannot compromise the need in the education sector. So that is what we are pursuing, and I feel that it is a great initiative that this Global Partnership Education will show us way forward and share ideas as to how we can overcome these problems that we are facing during this pandemic. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some ideas and thoughts with you this evening.
Madam Speaker, thank you for joining us and for finding time in your busy schedule to do so. What I'm really struck by from the interventions to date is the unanimity of understanding across the partnership and across parliamentarians of the significant risks posed by COVID, the challenges which you all face in returning children to school, and the commitment to the inclusion of the most marginalized, and particularly the girl students who face really quite significant risks of not attending school, not returning to school, and continuing with their education. So thank you for setting that out so clearly and for your leadership in Bangladesh. Colleagues, we are also joined today by a number of ministers for education, which we're very grateful to them for spending some time with us today. And I want to now go to Ms. Zeta Makri. Ms. Makri is the Greek Deputy Minister of Education and Religious Affairs for Primary, Secondary and Special Education. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored I'm here with you. And to be brief, as you suggested, I have to say that the prime concern of our Ministry of Education and Religious Affairs has been to ensure the sustainability of the educational community. In this respect, we designed and implemented 3 pillars of distance learning, namely synchronous education, asynchronous education, and also broadcast of educational television for primary school pupils. Both students and teachers' response was extremely positive. In order to address inequalities, our ministry ensured that telecommunication services provided free of charge access to national platforms and software for all students and teachers. Moreover, digital devices were provided to students for as long as they needed them for distance education purposes. The pandemic in Greece acted as an accelerator for the digital transformation of the country as several services got digitalized quickly and efficiently. The new National Digital Transformation Strategy provides safe, fast, and reliable access to the Internet for all. In parallel, teacher training seminars for distance education were also developed and empowered teachers to apply good quality distance education methodology, as well as use modern digital tools. In this sense, the challenge of distance education was turned into an opportunity not only to safeguard the right to quality education, but also to improve teachers' digital skills and social competencies. Last but not least, in primary and secondary education, schools have been supported by psychologists and social workers that were hired to deal with the consequences of COVID-19. The target has been to empower the school community to effectively handle critical and unpredictable situations and create a safe and sustainable school environment. Overall, the Hellenic Ministry of Education handled successfully an unprecedented and demanding situation for all direct and indirect members of the school community. To jointly address the common challenges that education systems face worldwide, we, as education policymakers, can place quality and inclusion in the heart of our decision processes. At an international level, it is important to share information, experiences, and best practices with all countries in order to promote important insights. The transformative potential of education may be recognized as an enabling driving force for a successful recovery. The need for investments in education, particularly in relation to digital education, including infrastructure and digital skills, constitutes a priority of governmental action. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And thank you for reminding us that although we face many challenges, there are also opportunities inherent in those challenges. And Greece has made good on those opportunities with its focus on improving access to digital learning and the quality of learning that can be supported by digital access. This is an issue of interest to many of our members around the world. And as you were speaking, I thought we might ask you to write some of those reflections for us, which we could then publish and share with our members, which is another important function of IPNED, which is to inspire and to share good practice. So yes, we'll be in touch with you on that front.
By all means, thank you so much.
And I'm reminded, of course, that Gordon Brown before you spoke about closing the digital gap and the importance of this. We had a presentation by our colleagues at the World Bank late last year, which illustrated that fewer than 6% of children in sub-Saharan Africa have access to digital devices, but also televisions and radio. So there's a huge amount of work to do there to realize that opportunity in those places. Colleagues, we're also joined today by various members of parliament from donor countries, and we're keen to hear from them about what they're doing. And I'm now going to call on Mike Lake. Mike is a member of parliament from Canada. He represents North America on IPNED's global executive. He's a huge champion of education, inclusive education in particular, and a great friend of the Global Partnership for Education. Mike, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph, and so great to see you, Julia. Nice to see you again. And I'm going to stay short in my comments because I'm looking at the time, and it's been a great event, but I know time is running tight. Just want to say what a great honor it is to work with parliamentarians from around the world, and to hear that the number now is over 300 members of parliament from around the world is fantastic. I noted that I have 3 colleagues, 4 of us in total here from Western Canada particularly, which is very encouraging. So I thank my colleagues for being a part of that. And for those of you on the call who have an interest in inclusive education for people with developmental disabilities, I have a 25-year-old son with autism. It's a passion for me as we do this broader work on inclusion for everybody in the school system. So please don't hesitate. I've put my contact in the chat, way back in the chat early on. Please don't hesitate to reach out and connect in any way we can. But just want to say a huge thank you to everyone that's here today, and finish with a thank you for the IPNED Secretariat led by Joseph, who do such great work on all of our behalf. Thank you.
Mike, that's very kind. So we are at the hour now, and we have the meeting will actually end at 15:15. So we have an additional 15 minutes, and I'm keen to go back to any of our speakers who want to make remarks. But there remains an opportunity for others on the call to indicate that they want to speak. And I can see that a member of Parliament from Colombia, Criselda Lobo Silva, has her hand up. Ms. Silva, over to you.
Muchísimas gracias, colegas, estimados colegas y compañeros de la Red Internacional de Parlamentarios por la Educación. Reciban un cordial saludo desde Colombia. Mi nombre es Criselda Lobo, senadora por el Partido de los Comunes. Fui guerrillera firmante del Acuerdo de Paz. Estamos firmemente comprometidos como partido en el derecho de la educación. Es fundamental para todas las personas, independientemente de su condición de género, raza o su condición social. Actualmente nuestro país atraviesa por un estallido social por la profunda crisis en que las políticas neoliberales aplicadas durante 30 años han afectado a la población, al cual le sumamos la profundización de la crisis por la pandemia del COVID. Este estallido social ha sido reprimido violentamente por la fuerza pública. Hoy tenemos más de 65 jóvenes que les han mutilado sus rostros a causa de la represión brutal por parte de la fuerza pública. Pero uno de los principales reclamos del pueblo, de los jóvenes, de las y los jóvenes, es el derecho a la educación pública de calidad y gratuita. Lograr esto solo será posible con un gobierno que interprete las necesidades de los colombianos y trace un nuevo rumbo para el país, el rumbo de la paz. Llamamos a la más amplia unidad y la lucha pacífica de todos los sectores y pedimos hoy aquí a mis colegas parlamentarios la solidaridad de los pueblos del mundo con esta noble causa como es la educación y la paz para Colombia. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes por escucharme.
Senadora, muchísimas gracias por su trabajo sobre el derecho a la educación. Really great to hear from you and to be reminded of the challenges which you face in Colombia, but also the excellent work. And congratulations on achieving the peace accords. May they last and may they grow. Colleagues, we also have various colleagues joining now who would like to speak. One of the things that IPNED tries to do is to amplify the good work of parliamentarians around the world. And I was very pleased that we had an opportunity to do that recently by facilitating the engagement of Danita Gatti in an event on inclusive education run by UNGAI. She spoke earlier this week at that, and she's joining us today. She represents people with disabilities in the Kenyan lower house, and I'm delighted that she has indicated she wants to speak. Danita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, and good evening from Nairobi, Kenya. And I'm glad to join this very important and vibrant discussion because I think, as you are aware, Kenya is co-hosting really the Global Education Summit in July. And we are happy because by co-hosting the Global Education Summit in July with the UK, that really shows commitment from my country, that is Kenya. My president is very, very particular in terms of supporting, education. And therefore, the fact that, so many partners have decided to put aside, so much money, $5 billion really to support, global education in developing countries is a clear indication, really. And I remember that in Kenya here, we recently had a virtual classroom tour where the UK president and my president, President Uhuru Kenyatta, really, co-chaired this virtual tour that is going actually to prepare ourselves for the July summit that really goes into raising awareness. So as a member of parliament, representing persons with disabilities, and as a very, very active member of the IPNED, I really want to thank IPNED because IPNED has actually taken a role to sensitize and to educate we as members of parliament, especially on the issue of the girls left behind, because the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, is basically to leave no one behind. So we have about 9 years left, really 8 years really to 2030. So therefore, I really like the whole idea that IPNED and partners really are coming up together to really ensure that we are leaving no one behind. Because if you look at the issue of financing for education, really, most of the times the girls who are left behind when you're talking about financing education are children with disabilities, or they are learners with disabilities. And we saw this a lot when Corona hit, the entire world. Children with disabilities have had no access to education. And we have tried as a country, that is Kenya, and I'm very proud of my president because he has been in the forefront, helping us as members of parliament really to champion, education financing on the floor of the house in terms of motions, in terms of, bills that really ensure that the education budget that is allocated really go to support education for learners with disabilities. So my call to especially the G7 summit that is coming up and the Global Education Summit that is coming up is really to ensure that financing really touches children with disabilities, learners with disabilities, and especially girls with disabilities. So education must actually commit to inclusion of our girls with disabilities. Therefore, that the 5 billion that is going to be raised, that I'm very glad that donors are actually, and our partners are actually committing to supporting education for girls in developing countries. I mean, Kenya is one of the developing countries, and so many of our African countries. I also chair the Africa Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and these are the issues that we raise beyond IPNED and beyond the CPA, and therefore I'm honored to be able to participate. In 2018, you remember Kenya and the UK government also hosted the Global Disability Summit in London, and we continue to raise the bar in terms of partnership, in terms of ensuring that girls and children with disabilities are really on board. And I want to take this opportunity very, very much to thank you, the UK government and partners, really for helping us to amplify the voices of our girls and our learners with disabilities, and therefore really to push the agenda for commitment of budgets into advancing the infrastructure in terms of advancing everything that really ensures that girls with disabilities are on board. Thank you very much, Joseph, and your team for this great opportunity to present. Thank you.
Honourable Danita Gati, thank you. Thank you for your excellent work in Kenya and for reminding everyone on the call about the summit that's coming up and the G7 summit, which happens next week, and the importance of all of those donor countries which are meeting at the G7 to make good on the promises that they've made to support the world to deliver quality education for all. We've got our fingers crossed for that, and we're inviting all of you to push home those messages. So thank you. Colleagues, there are a couple of more people who have asked for the floor. We have time to go to them, but they're going to need to be brief because I am very keen to give the Honourable Julia Gillard the chance to reflect on the conversation that we've had today and make some final remarks. Edgard Trabusi, you're from Lebanon. Please, you have the floor.
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me? Thank you for IPNED for this great opportunity to meet other colleagues from around the world. As you may know, Lebanon is enduring a severe and prolonged economic depression. According to the latest World Bank, Lebanon, in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic and the Beirut blast, which happened in August 2020, also it is affected by the health and education sectors. The presence of the Syrian and Palestinian refugees also affects the country in numerous ways. For this reason, we humbly seek the assistance of IPNED and other international organizations and donors in delivering resilient quality education for all to ensure child protection and inclusion regardless of nationality. Without your help and the help of the world community, we are at risk of losing the educational sector in Lebanon, which is the only heritage we have for our future generations. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for those remarks and for reminding us of the situation in Lebanon and in the wider Middle East, which faces very significant challenges. We're conscious of those, you're in our thoughts, and we hope that the Global Partnership for Education and others can support you as much as possible. Colleagues, I might just turn now to our colleague, Sekuba. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Hello, are you hearing me?
If you are, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm the Member of Parliament from the Gambia. I'm happy to be part of this forum. A teacher through my background, also a parliamentarian and part of the Committee on Education. I have a question that I wanted to put because I'm a new parliamentarian, and almost all of us in the parliament are new. Because if you are following the trend in the Gambia, we have a change of government some 4 years ago. So everything was new. So we were all new. I want to know in the best practice in other parliaments, what are the relationship between the Education Committee in the Parliament and the Minister of Education? Because in the Gambia, it's separate. Parliamentarians are only parliamentarians, but in other countries, like when you go to Ghana, a parliamentarian can be a minister. So there is synchrony in their job. But for us, it's separate. So I want to know what is the relationship in other parliaments. And also, we have a passion for funding education, but normally the budgeting comes from the executive. So they will come. Sometimes we will not agree to some of their programs. We'll put those ones out. Precisely, they come with their programs. So I want to know the best practice from other parliaments. What is the relationship between the committee in the parliament and the Minister of Education? And also, is it that I was trying to think in other parliaments, do education committees have their priority?
Great. Thanks, Mr. Judge. That's an excellent question. And it really is central to the work of IPNED. Like you, we've had a number of chairs of parliamentary committees, education committees in particular, reach out to us, asking for support, asking for an exchange with their peers across other parliamentary committees, and we are working to create those opportunities. So we're going to take your question today on notice with a firm commitment to get back to you. And I would just say to everyone on the call today, if you're interested in sharing your experiences with others, including our colleagues from the Gambia, we'd be interested in hearing from you and to facilitate those very links. Colleagues, we heard from Minister Sengay earlier, and as Manaz said, we were joined by some civil society representatives in Sierra Leone, as well as some girl champions. And I know that some of those girls have indicated that they'd like to make a very brief statement in response. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm actually going to call on Julia and Minister Sengay to make some closing remarks. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of the people who have their hand up in order to finish on time, for which I apologize. These things are always very tight, but we really appreciate your contributions today and your participation. So if I could beg your indulgence, that's the process we're going to follow. So I'm just going to ask now for the girls who are joining us from Sierra Leone to say a few words.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Joseph, for this one. And I will ask my colleague, Lydia, from Plan International to introduce the girls to us, and also to our Honorable Minister, Dr. Sengay. It clearly shows that young men can take the leadership around education, because he has been doing a very terrific job around education. Again, the few concerned, the guys who share those concerns, is about the sensitivity about the budget. Yes, we now know that our budget is 22% has been allocated to education, but we want to know how sensitive it is. Those marginalized groups, how we can respond to them. And that is why the guys are here. They will interact with this process, and we don't have enough time. So I will pass on the mic to my colleague, Lydia, so that he can facilitate the guys so that we can hear from them. Thank you. Over to you, Lydia.
Yes, thank you so much, Augustine, and thanks so much, Joseph, for this opportunity. I just want to hand over now to Fatou, one of our Guards leaders in Sierra Leone, to just make a statement. Over to you, Fatou.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I am Fatou, youth advocate for Plan International and also a GBE youth leader. On behalf of every other young girl in Sierra Leone, we want to acknowledge the government of Sierra Leone and also the Minister of Education. Just imagine 22% of our national budget is a big win here for Sierra Leone. We have young girls who can access education. This shows the world that Sierra Leone is ready for greatness. Sierra Leone is ready to open spaces for education, because I tell people quality education is not cheap. If our government is taking a move like this, giving 22% of our national budget to education, then it means we are ready for change, and it is important to us. So every other young girl in Sierra Leone is happy for this. We all know Sierra Leone has been hit by so many crises. When you talk about the 11-year civil war, you talk about the Ebola, you talk about the COVID-19, which is going on presently, which is a world pandemic that is affecting most young girls. Supporting education is very important in times like this, and our government has really supported us. Imagine when we went through the Ebola crisis here in Sierra Leone, we saw a vast increase of teenage pregnancy, child marriage, and so many other things, because young girls stay at home and we were not going to school. But with the government of Sierra Leone providing the learning program presently for Sierra Leone, that's a big win, and it's going to help us protect the amount of teenage pregnancy. Being out of school does not just have devastating consequences on us girls, it places us at risk of teenage pregnancy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, and all forms of gender-based violence. Education has the power to transform harmful gender norms and empower us as girls, leaders, and give us the opportunity to come together to bring collective agents, to be collective agents of change. With education, we can help solve most of the inequalities in our countries. So on behalf of all the young girls in Sierra Leone, we ask the Minister of Education to happily commit to us that he's going to meet us locally so we can discuss. So when he goes to England, when he speaks to anybody, he's going to reflect the views of young girls here in Sierra Leone. So we ask him to commit.
Thank you. Thank you, Lydia. Incredibly powerful, articulate overview of the case for education and the importance of prioritizing access and quality learning for girls. Thank you. So colleagues, I'm very conscious of time. We've run over a little. I want to give our two principal speakers who are still with us a brief opportunity to respond. I'm going to turn in the first instance to Minister Sengay, and then Julia, the floor will be yours to wrap us up, send us on our way, and inspire us to action. Minister.
Thank you. I mean, I think as the speakers indicated just now, even within that 22%, only 1% of that goes to early childhood education. And I committed in front of the president that we'll seek to make that the global 10% recommendation. So we ourselves are pushing the boundary. We have the radical inclusion in schools policy that has budgetary commitments, and we'll try to ensure that girls and girls' welfare becomes important. Government committed to providing free sanitary hygiene kits to girls starting in September. So we're committing. Lydia, yes, contact my office and we'll meet. I mean, I hope you also participate in the joint sector review that's ongoing. We'll have a LEG meeting, and I know that Education for All EFA is part of LEG, and I think LEG meetings are coming up soon. But we are fully committed to do this, and my doors are always open. You guys can come around. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Minister. Thanks for joining today, for your commitment and for your willingness to engage civil society, which is another important principle for IPNED, which is to facilitate those links. Julia, you joined earlier on. Thank you very much for sitting with us and for hearing the conversation today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It's been terrific to join you, to join my colleague, Minister Sengay, who also does so much important work at the Global Partnership for Education. What I've heard today is a lot of agreement about the importance of education to changing lives for individuals, but also changing the pathway of nations and ultimately, therefore, our whole world. I've heard a real sense of urgency. People understand that education has suffered during the days of the pandemic, that the needs are great and that we must respond to that depth of need. And I've certainly heard people calling for and very focused on delivering inclusion for every child, for girls, for children with disabilities, for the children most likely to miss out on education. And what I can certainly say to you is at the Global Partnership for Education, these are all of our watchwords to include, to increase quality, to increase access, and to mobilise for change. We too believe that education is the best way of changing the world. So can I end where I started, saying I'm really delighted to have participated today, but I'll be even more delighted to see everybody leave this meeting energised and ready to do everything that they can in the short weeks that remain between now and the end of July to mobilise the maximum effort for education, whether that's from the perspective of a country that is an international aid donor or a developing country committing to increasing its education budget. We want to see the two come together with a huge meeting of minds and a great degree of force and ambition in the UK, co-hosted by the UK and Kenya in July. At the Global Partnership for Education, we're champing at the bit to get that out there replenished with at least $5 billion to make a difference for education, but we can only do it with your support and your activism in the weeks to come. So please do get involved and engage, take these sentiments beyond this virtual meeting room into your parliaments, to your ministers, to your presidents, to your prime ministers, and together I'm very confident we will be able to make a huge difference.
Julia, thank you. I think you've been very clear in the task that's before all of us on this call today, which is to take the conversation which we've had back to our parliaments, back to ministers, if we're from donors, to ensure that GPE is fully funded with $5 billion in July, and if we're from developing countries, to encourage our heads of government to sign the statement from President Kenyatta and commit to increasing and improving their financing for education. At IPNED, we talk about building political leadership for global education. And I can't say anything other than really you are the personification of that. You're really a fantastic example to all of us about what that looks like in practice. And we pay tribute to your leadership. We thank you for your participation today. And we wish you and the Global Partnership all the very best for the replenishment and beyond. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to all of our speakers, colleagues. Go forth and do your work, and may education opportunity flourish.